This is Duke University.
It's interesting to think about the difference between a supply chain and a value chain. 2 months ago, there was an article in the New York Times about Apple's iPod. And it wanted to give an analysis of where the iPod is made from a value chain point of view. And what the article said was that an iPod has 450 parts. Some researchers at UC Irvine that were in a Sloan Industry Center for Personal Computers figured out where all those parts came from and how much they cost, because they wanted to, so the supply chain is, what are those 450 parts? How do they go into sub-assemblies? And how do they make an iPod? The value chain is laying on top of that, which companies make the most money, have the most power in that chain. So their analysis actually shows that Apple, unsurprisingly, for a $300 30 gigabyte video iPod at retail, Apple gets $80 of every one sold. Now, Apple makes nothing in that product. It's pure design. It's the intellectual property of having created the iPod. The single biggest manufacturer is Toshiba, which makes the hard disk drive in the iPod, which goes for $63. They calculated what all American companies and workers got from that $300 iPod, and it comes to about $163, or 55% of the value of the iPod. But they asked where it was made. If I was to ask you to guess, I'm sure most of you would probably come up with the answer that these are all made in China. They're made in, most of them in a giant factory complex owned by a company called Foxconn, owned by Taiwanese, outside a city in China called Dongguan. The factory complex has 300,000 workers, 110 buildings on the campus. They assemble all the iPods, and the cost of the assembly for China is $4 per item. So what China gets out of that $300 iPod is $4. But the reason why this kind of value chain analysis is important is when China exports that iPod, having imported all the parts from Japanese and US and other component makers, the value as it hits the US shores is $150. So in terms of the trade disparity we have with China, we're all familiar with the fact that we're saying that the US has this giant trade deficit with China. Well, in fact, much of that is an accounting fiction because China's value added to the iPod is $4. In fact, all of these other countries that are shipping the parts for the iPod, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, are actually avoiding a lot of the heat from having a trade deficit with the US. So China's being charged $150 towards their balance of payments deficit. They have a surplus with the US, we have a deficit with them. So this kind of analysis actually becomes really important in figuring out what role different countries play in these industries. So,
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.